Hello guys, Charles here and welcome back to my channel. So today I want to talk about a rarely discussed harmonic device from the classical world that's very close to something we use in the jazz world, but a slightly different beast. This is by no means an essential lesson. This is just something that if you're interested, we can have a little look at this together. This device is called a Neapolitan 6th chord. Now a Neapolitan 6th chord has been used from Bach till Bartok, and it's used a lot in film soundtracks. Actually, I hear it a lot there. It's essentially a decoration of the 2-5-1. It's very close to a 2-5-1, and it's even closer to a very specific jazz harmonic concept, which we'll get to in a moment. My theory teacher used to make us say this every single morning. Sunday morning, I'd get to my theory class and we'd have to sit down and we'd have to recite a flattened supertonic major in its first inversion. Flattened supertonic major in its first inversion. Flattened supertonic major in its first inversion. That's how you learn music, really fun. Now, what does that mean? Well, flattened obviously means lowered. Supertonic. Now, supertonic comes from the classical labelling system for the notes. So we may as well cover that in this lesson because it's relevant. Tonic is what we call the root. So some people do call it the tonic still in jazz, but root and tonic are synonymous. It means the first note of the scale. Dominant is another word that's shared between the jazz world and the classical world. That means the fifth degree. So there's a few notes already that are labelled using those. We've got the tonic, which is the root, the dominant, which is the fifth, and the subdominant, which is the fifth below. That's the fourth. So I always used to think subdominant meant it's below the dominant. So that was always useful for me, but it actually means it's below the tonic by a fifth, and that gives us a fourth. That's our cycle of fifths and our cycle of fourths. We've also then got the mediant. The mediant is the name for the third of the scale. So we've got the mediant and the submediant. Again, that means below the tonic, below the root, which is the sixth degree. The sixth is a third lower than the root. So that actually gives us most of our notes already. So all we've got left is the second degree, which we call the supertonic. Super meaning higher than or greater than. So 2, of course, is higher than or greater than 1. So that's the supertonic. And then finally the leading note, which is the 7th degree of the scale because it leads us back into our tonic. So the classical naming system for all of those is tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, leading note. So if we go back to my little recital, it was the flattened supertonic major in its first inversion. So that means it's the flattened second supertonic. The flattened 2 major, because of course the 2 is normally minor. If we're in the key of C, we'd have D minor on the 2. So it's the flattened supertonic, D flat, major, D flat major, in its first inversion. So let's quickly talk about inversions again because it's relevant. It's not something I've talked about a lot on this channel. I talk about chord voicing rotations. Now the difference that I try and make between a voicing rotation and an inversion is that all an inversion is interested in is the bottom note of the chord. All it's interested in is the bottom note of the chord. A voicing rotation means every single note of the chord has to shift. Every single note of that voicing changes and it becomes a brand new voicing. Whereas with an inversion, I can take this basic C chord here that we all know, this cowboy chord. I can play it in its first inversion by simply adding the low E string underneath it, but the chord itself hasn't changed, the voicing hasn't changed. So that's a C in its first inversion, and then I can do C in its second inversion by adding the G at the bottom, which is here on the 3rd fret of the E string. So that voicing hasn't changed at all. It's the same voicing, I'm just changing what the bass note, the lowest possible note is, and that's an inversion. So I hope you understand the difference there. When I talk about chord voicing rotations, I'm doing this sort of thing. Every note is rotating. I hope you can see the difference. So now we've got all the lingo out the way, we're finally at the point where we can understand what this Neapolitan 6th chord is. So it's its flattened supertonic, D flat in the key of C, major, D flat major, in its first inversion. Well, if we invert D flat once, we'd have F at the bottom. So one way of playing that would be this voicing here. So I've got F, A flat, D flat, and A flat. fret, 8, 6, 6, 9 on these middle 4 strings. Now, where do we use a Neapolitan sixth? By itself, out of context, it doesn't really sound anything special, it's just a first inversion chord. Well, we normally use it to go to a 5 chord. So any chord that goes to a 5 chord can be substituted for a Neapolitan sixth. A 5-1, what we call, again, here's some more lingo for you, a perfect cadence. A cadence is another word for a resolution. The 5-1 is the perfect resolution, it's the dream scenario, so we call that perfect cadence. And we can put this Neapolitan sixth chord before that perfect cadence. So let's hear one in context. So in the key of C, our perfect cadence would be G to C. So we're going to put this D flat in its first inversion chord before the G, and that would sound something like this. Now I voice led that to taste, but I'm going to play that again with some more simple voicings. So that's the effect it gives us. So this is just another option that we can put before a 5-1. So what do we use a lot in jazz? Well, we use a 2-5-1, which sounds like this. Which would become this. Two. Neapolitan sixth. Really nice sound. What else do we often use? Well, in the classical world, we don't tend to talk about 2-5-1s, we tend to talk about 4-5-1s. So that would be F, G, C. Now, of course, F is just an inversion of D minor. The 4 is the relative major of the 2. But this is what it would sound like with just an F, G, C, 4-5-1. Swap that out for the Neapolitan sixth chord, which has an F in the bass. What else can we swap it out for? Well, we've got a minor 4, 5-1. So the minor 4 is the same as having a half diminished 2. So minor 2-5 might sound something like this. Let's try swapping that out for, let's go for a different voicing this time. Let's try this one. Really nice voicing. So where would you use this? Well, as is always the case, you can superimpose harmonic devices as a soloist. So if you want, you could play a D flat chord in its first inversion instead of one of those chords which precedes the 5. You could swap it out for a Neapolitan sixth pretty much wherever you want, and you'd be highlighting some interesting colours there. So any chord that precedes the 5-1 you could swap out for the Neapolitan sixth as a soloist if you wanted to. However, I said at the start that this is very close to a jazz device that we have. So what is that? So remember that a 2-5-1 can be merged into a 5-1. This is the thing that we talk about a lot, which is Barry Harris's interpretation of a 2-5-1. 2-5-1 can simply become 5-1, especially in instances where we don't have as much time. For example, if the 2 and the 5 are both in the same bar, versus if there was 2 bars of a 2 and 2 bars of a 5, then 4 bars of a 1. You'd have plenty of time to play a 2 there and plenty of time to play a 5. If you've only got 1 bar to do both, it's easier to just go 5-1. So thinking of it in those terms, if we just think of this cadence as a 5-1, including that Neapolitan sixth chord, so we'll just think this is a 5, this is a 5, and a 1. Well, then that D flat chord becomes something very familiar to us, especially if we make it a dominant. Listen to this. So what we just did there was played the tritone substitution. And I'm going to play it now in a voicing that would make a bit more sense to us. So a D flat to G is just the tritone. So all this is a very early predecessor of the tritone substitution. However, I really like its clarity. The fact that it doesn't have the 7 in it is quite charming. I like that. I think that's really nice. So when you're using this device don't think of it as a Neapolitan sixth, just think of it as maybe a slightly stripped back tritone substitution. If you're not sure what a tritone substitution is, have a little look up here and look at the Spicy 2/5 video, and that'll explain all the other substitutions available on this 2/5. So that's all I wanted to cover today, is just exploring that slightly new sound world with you. Now I've pointed out, you'll hear this all the time, like I say, especially in film music. I think I was kind of accidentally playing something that sounded like Spider-Man to me there. So I think it's maybe even in that, the proper ones, the ones with Tobey Maguire. Please leave me a comment down below with what you'd like to see in the next one. I've had some really good comments recently, which I assure you I am working on. I can't always just blast these things out straight away. I need to give them some serious thought. But I assure you, if you've made a suggestion in the past, that I am giving it plenty of thought and working on those. If you found this one useful, please do give it a like, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and share with any of your friends who might also benefit from learning about the Neapolitan sixth chord. And as always, I hope you're all doing very well, getting plenty of practice in, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.
Roll up, let me embed a story you'll never forget. A drip, drip, you're drowning in debt now. You can't buy your way out, and I heard you find it difficult to